Good evening. Good evening. I'm Cassie Pekarsky, the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Truman Library Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone in person and online to tonight's program, Macarthur'S Gamble, the Inchon Landing. Before we launch into tonight's event, please forgive me as I put a plug in for our next program and our most anticipated member event of the year, the 2025 Bennett Forum on the Presidency. 80 years after President Truman helped end World War II and laid the groundwork for a new era of international cooperation and democratic alliances, the world faces rising tensions and growing uncertainty about America's direction. On November 18th, join political commentator Anna Palmer in conversation with historian David Greenberg and U.S. Ambassador Jeff Flake as they examine the world Truman built and the state of his legacy. You can learn more at trumanlibraryinstitute.org. Now, on June 24th, 1950, President Truman was relaxing at his home at 219 North Delaware in Independence, Missouri, after enjoying dinner with his wife Bess and daughter Margaret when the phone rang. Now, good news almost never comes from a 9 p.m. phone call. On the line was Secretary of State Dean Acheson. "Mr. President, I have some serious news." Troops from North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, had invaded South Korea in an attempt to unify the country under totalitarian communist rule. His daughter Margaret remembered, "My father made it clear that he feared this was the opening of World War III. President Truman immediately headed back to Washington, D.C., and appealed to the United Nations to intervene, almost 5 years to the day after the charter signing on June 26, 1945. Calling it a police action under the United Nations, Truman circumvented the constitutional requirement that only Congress could declare war. For better or for worse, it set a precedent for future presidential military action, and days later, American air, naval, and ground forces joined troops from 6 continents to make up the UN forces under General Douglas MacArthur, who was appointed head of the United Nations Command. Now, in 1948, President Truman had signed a peacetime draft legislation to supplement voluntary military recruitment because of his concerns about increasing Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. The Universal Military Training and Service Act of 1951 expanded the draft, requiring all males ages 18 to 26 to register and mandating a 2-year service term. More than 1.5 million men were drafted into service, including my grandfather, who landed at Pusan on August 5th, 1951, with the 23rd Regiment of the 2nd Infantry Division, where he was a forward observer for the Heavy Weapons Company. For this reason and many others, it's my honor to be here tonight to commemorate a significant moment in this so-called forgotten war and all of the men and women that served and sacrificed for our country. It's my privilege to welcome one of America's most prominent military historians, John C. McManus. John is Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. When he isn't teaching, he's in frequent demand as a speaker and expert commentator. In addition to dozens of local and national radio programs, he's appeared on, wait for it, CNN, C-SPAN, the Military Channel, the Discovery Channel, the National Geographic Channel, Netflix, the Smithsonian Network, the History Channel, and PBS, among others. He has served as historical advisor for a best-selling World War II video game and is the host of 3 podcasts. And if that isn't enough, he's the author of 15 books, and his current project is a major biography of General Matthew Ridgway, who commanded the 8th Army in the Korean War. Joining John on stage this evening is Jason Parker. Jason is a professor of history at Texas A&M. He is an author of 2 books focusing on foreign policy and the Cold War, and is an incredible advocate of President Truman's legacy. First as a recipient of one of the Truman Library Institute's research fellowships, and now as a member of our board of directors. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the program, so please keep track of your questions, and as always, please make sure that it is a question. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming John McManus and Jason Parker.
pleasure to be on stage with John. I wasn't sure exactly how much I wanted to sort of frame the Cold War setting with the military course of events that will happen in the course of John's book, but I wanted to lay the stage a little bit this way. If you ask a dozen of my colleagues in Cold War history when exactly the Cold War started, you're liable to get a dozen different answers. Because unlike World War II, unlike World War I even, it's difficult to pinpoint the moments when all players cross the starting line. It may not be. I tend to rely on my natural projection abilities.
Yeah, great projection.
Check. Well, until we get that solved, I'll just keep talking. Check. Yes? Can you hear me in the back? I'm a drummer. I don't usually get a microphone. So I have to sort of go louder. But I will say that one of the things about, and the folks watching on Zoom, you'll just have to sort of catch up on the closed caption, I guess. One of the things that's fascinating about this, and one of the things I think is a point of entry for the students to sort of engage in the real fun of history, is not just arguing about sort of the facts themselves, but about what they mean. And so figuring out when the Cold War started is one of those challenges, because it forces you to underline the things you think are the defining features of it. However, even if you took those same prospective, yay, excellent, thank you, sir. Even if you take those same prospective, like 12 colleagues of mine, and ask them when the starting point is, everyone would agree that by the time you get to the Korean War, it is fully on. The various candidates before that, the Truman Doctrine or the Berlin Airlift or what have you, those come before the moment when it's clear that the Cold War could turn hot. And you saw that most vividly in the Korean Peninsula. Within the Korean Peninsula, what you get is, as I described to my students, a kind of a tennis match war. So you're looking this way as the North invades, goes down to Pusan. You're looking that way as it heads back up to the border after the Inchon landing, and then it stabilizes in the middle of the peninsula for the latter half of the war, really. But the idea that this is something that is not just a military conflict, but something historians argue about the deeper meaning of, is it a civil war that got sort of demonically possessed by the Cold War, by outside forces? Is it something that was always the creature of the superpowers as they sort of felt their oats, the US, Soviet Union, and crucially China in this story? These are the kind of things that sort of are still at the macro level before you get to the precise sort of sequence of military interventions. And in the tennis match, one of the crucial serves, if you will, has to do with MacArthur and the Inchon landing. So I guess I wanted to start by asking John, what's the gamble? This seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, and you mentioned hit them where they ain't. Well, MacArthur had used that phrase in World War II in relation to how he was going to defend the Philippines, and that didn't work out very well for him in 1941 and 42. But in the interim, he had become really a pretty master practitioner of amphibious operations through the rest of World War II. So he understood them very well, what they entailed, how to work with the Navy, how to work with the Air Force, what kind of loading plans you would have, how you figure out how to reorganize ground combat units to be amphibious capable. And so from the beginning of what becomes the Korean War, and I'm talking like late June 1950, MacArthur's already thinking of an amphibious invasion behind the North Korean lines because, of course, they have this kind of three-pronged advance that goes very deep into South Korea that famously pens the UN into the Pusan perimeter. And well before that happens, he's thinking about this invasion behind them because he had done that sometimes in World War II. I think Inchon, in some ways, is most analogous to the invasion of Hollandia in April 1944, which completely outflanks the Japanese on New Guinea and is a great accelerator, ultimately, that allows MacArthur to invade the Philippines in October of that year. So I think that's kind of in his mind, that kind of operational muscle memory. to have this, but it's having to evolve as the situation gets worse tactically throughout the summer of 1950. He's got to constantly adjust his plan, much less, of course, sell it to the Joint Chiefs, who are very leery of it because, yes, it is really risky. So, so they've changed even names of it from whatever was blue something to chromite, and so it's had all these different iterations. By the time we get to September, this has been on the books really a long time. And the issue we've got by that point in time is having a full division amphibious capable. And it's supremely ironic because I'll tell you, by the end of World War II, the United States military, particularly the U.S. Army, but also the Marine Corps too, in terms of amphibious operations and expertise, is way beyond the rest of the world. And yet in a 5-year period, we have degraded such that we really only we can scrape together maybe one amphibious capable division size unit for what he envisions in this operation. In the meantime, too, he's had to kind of parry different concepts that the Navy has and also General Collins, J. Lawton Collins, who's Army Chief of Staff, who think going at Inchon is just simply too far behind the lines, much less all the other problems Inchon presents as a place to land. But they want a kind of shorter envelopment closer to the Pusan perimeter, and he's kind of had to fence with them over that as well.
So what were the arguments for the other alternatives, Gunsan or what have you, for some other choice than right there at the midsection?
Yeah, so Inchon itself, of course, is really a horrible place to invade. For one thing, you're invading into a built-up urbanized area. And those of you who've heard anything about the Dieppe invasion that the Canadians launched in August 1942, you'll be familiar with the fact that it's a very difficult thing to come into more or less town or urbanized terrain straight from the sea. That's easier for the defenders. And so that's kind of in the mind too, much less, of course, the tidal problems that lead you to not be able to get your LSTs and your other shipping in there through the whole day, the mud flats, all the fortified islands that you could have, much less what they could have at Inchon itself. So that's certainly a downside. And the Joint Chiefs are arguing, why are we messing with that when we can have this shorter envelopment, it's safer. We're going to get ashore more readily, and we're going to be closer in to link up with 8th Army when it comes out of the Pusan perimeter.
Okay. Well, and if I can pull together a couple of threads, you mentioned the phrase muscle memory and also the degraded capabilities. How is it possible that you have this sort of inheritors of the Normandy invasion who then come to this situation and find themselves scrambling to figure out exactly what's the best option? Had all that degraded so greatly that all the people who masterminded Normandy are doing other jobs or passed on or what have you?
Yeah, and of course, the main guy who masterminded is no longer in uniform when the Korean War breaks out, Dwight Eisenhower. He's president of Columbia University. He's coming back, though, obviously, to head up the NATO command. So the answer to that, you just kind of have to delve deeper into American post-war military policy. At the end of the war, 9 out of 10 GIs want to get home, and they want to get out of uniform, and they want to get back to real life. And this is a very American thing. We've won the kinetic fight, and so that's the fight. And it's not a matter of what follows. All the difficult stability and support operations, the humanitarian operations, the long-term security issues, all of that kind of stuff is not as popular, in terms of rallying people to serve. And people want to get back to the civilian economy. It's fully understandable, of course. But the downside of that is that we kind of cut our military capability to the bone. And one of the reasons we do that is we have a nuclear monopoly for about 4 years, and so policymakers are tempted to say, okay, well, we can kind of economize. We don't have to have conventional forces as much anymore because they're expensive to build and maintain. And of course, I don't just mean that financially, I mean that in terms of personnel, in terms of the bite on society, if you have a big drafty army or whatever, of forcing all of us to serve, So this was a politically easier way, a financially easier way, because the country had spent itself into debt during World War II. And so this was very much the popular thing, and what that meant was our conventional capability had really been drastically reduced. The Air Force gets its independence September 18, 1947, and there's a temptation then to rely on air power, in which, no question, that we lead the world in terms of aerial capability. But we're going to have to learn the hard way that that's not enough. And so what we've got by 1950, sadly, is a really hollow conventional force in terms of naval capability. So many of our ships have been put into mothballs or Navy yards or sold off. But in terms of ground force capability, you're talking about some really hollow formations in the occupation of Japan. What I mean by that, a normal infantry regiment would have 3 battalions, and so that would be about 3,000, 3,500 soldiers, something like that. Well, you're talking about maybe 2 battalions that themselves are under strength by 1950 by the time the North Koreans invade. So that means you've got maybe about half the combat power. You've got maybe half as many tanks, about half of them are in storage. You don't have the engineering capability. You just don't have the same kind of potency. And of course, amphibious capability is a casualty of that too. So that means you don't have as many LSTs in play, as many LCVPs, the famous Higgins boats that would be available for you, the troop ships, the naval forces to protect them, not as many destroyers and cruisers and battleships, and of course naval aviation as well. And so all of that has had a kind of ripple effect until we have this crisis, and then we're scrambling. And that's a very American thing, is to finally get some sort of consensus that comes out of crisis, and so we're kind of scrambling in the summer of 1950. And just as an historian, I find that period so incredibly troubling because one of the great lessons of World War II is that we weren't prepared, of course, and we really pay a price for that earlier in the war. And so here we learn the same lesson again in 1950. What does that mean? It means if I'm some poor guy as part of Task Force Smith or some other unit on the ground in the summer of 1950 in the Pusan perimeter, I'm done. I mean, I'm not prepared. I'm not armed well enough. I'm not supplied well enough. It's a horrifying thing.
Yeah, in fact, to build on that, maybe y'all will do better than the my average students. When I asked them to pick the country that was ranked above the United States in terms of the size of its military when World War II begins, pick a country. You're probably right, but no takers.
I'll name one.
Portugal is way ahead of us. Right ahead of us, like in the top 25 rankings. Romania,
yes.
The United States military is smaller than the Romanian military when the thing begins.
Yeah.
And so you stand up a military from scratch, basically, because of the sort of historic associations of standing armies being the tools of tyranny, and it goes back to the founders, and there's good reasons for this, but the American habit is you don't build a military until you need it, and then as soon as you don't need it, you demobilize it. Mm-hmm. And so the speed of that demobilization leaves you in the situation.
Yeah, and there's precedence for this in American history, more recent American history. We've done that after World War I. Right. We basically back out of even a defense pact that we were going to have with the French and the British on some level, and of course we basically demobilize our military forces. The U.S. side, after the conventional end of the Civil War in 1865, does more or less the same thing. The Army of the Potomac and the other Union armies are dismantled, and so what do you have left? You've got about 28,000 troops available for the frontier, for reconstruction, for pretty much everything else you have to do, and so we just kind of learn and relearn this lesson again. You kind of see the same thing after Desert Storm to a lesser level. So this is something of the American way, and it's true that the United States comes out of World War II as a global military superpower, partially because of its economy and because of its air power, its sea power, its nuclear power. But what pays the price as much as anything is the ground power, and that's exactly what we're going to need in Korea, ironically, is the ground power.
And it's where the sort of broader Cold War diplomatic context comes back into play, because you have this phase after 45 in which it looks like George Kennan's version of containment is working. Just hold the line and wait them out. Doesn't need a big standing military. You have the atomic monopoly. If you push back where they push outward, then you can essentially sort of play the long game. And then in the blink of an eye, the Soviet acquisition of the bomb, the Chinese revolution under Mao Zedong and the rise of communist China, and then McCarthyism here at home, The three of these things together form this sort of body blow to the Kennan version of containment that puts us towards what Korea will seem to vindicate, right? The sort of direction towards the document NSC 68 that sort of re-envisions the Cold War as this truly global thing, that you can't just pick and choose your battles over the long game as Kennan prescribed, but rather you have to sort of be on the ramparts all the time, including building back up the military. This is a document that is still being debated in the halls of the White House and among Truman's team when the Korean War breaks out. Truman himself thought this would be too expensive. He didn't like the idea of quadrupling the defense budget on a long-standing basis because of that American tradition of having no strong or large standing military. But Korea forces the issue.
Yeah, and Truman felt that, you know, he could unify the armed forces too. You have that whole thing. He's not a fan of the Marine Corps, and he sees it as redundant to the Army. So there's that whole subplot going on. You've had the revolt of the admirals against his Secretary of Defense, Johnson, you know, and wanting to basically cut the shipping capability on many levels. Truman, you know, I often think that NSC 68 lands on his desk with the force of a bombshell in a way, because this is the wake-up call. This is what I often tell my students is Joe McCarthy and his allies are kind of selling you on the easy way to stop communism. Oh, there's a spy here, there's a subversive, there's a traitor. Turn him in and we're all safe now. And by the way, he hardly really doesn't identify many communists. That's the irony of the whole thing too. But that's the easy way, isn't it? All you got to do is vote for him, support him and his allies, and there you go. NSC 68 is the real world now. It is a you know, quadrupling of the defense budget, so that's more of your tax money. But it also, of course, envisions the U.S. as the world policeman, as defending the, quote, free world. And what that means is a lot of us are going to be in uniform now. And we're going to be in harm's way, and there's nothing more that could ever be asked of any of us than to shed blood somewhere on foreign soil. Korean War, of course, brings this into reality. And I tend to think that on some level, you know, post-Inchon, post-Chinese entry and all that, that Truman's biggest agenda on some level is to make sure that NSC 68 is implemented to some degree, I guess, I suppose, along with a kind of limited war containment kind of view of Korea. But yeah, I mean, all of this is just playing out, you know, kind of in real time as Korea happens. And so from a military standpoint, though, too, I mean, the war leans very heavily in its first phase on reservists. So if you were unwise enough when you got out, when you as a World War II veteran to you know, get that reserve money, stay in, get a little money, a little extra military time, probably not that good a decision by 1950, especially if you're a Marine. Because, man, if you're a Marine in 1950 or as a reservist, they are coming after you. How do you think we get these guys for Inchon? They just scrape the Marine Corps clean of anybody they can lay hands on, because obviously the Marines know a lot about amphibious operations. So the 1st Marine Division is going to be our entry point to this. I think it's so ironic, too, because in 1942, you know, we don't have that many amphibious capable divisions, and we decide we're going to invade at Guadalcanal. We're like, okay, where are we going to get an amphibious capable division to do this? And it's the 1st Marine Division then, and then 8 years later, it's the 1st Marine Division again for Inchon. In 1942, it's because your 2 other major divisions, or Army divisions that were going to North Africa, the 1st and the 3rd, and then the 1st Marine Division to Guadalcanal. So here we are 8 years later, sort of right back in something of the same place. And they're hurriedly training the Army 7th Infantry Division, the Hourglass Division, which by the way still exists out of Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington. And so they're getting hurriedly trained in Japan, and they're getting their ranks fleshed out because they've had their initial cadre stripped out to send in, you know, to deal with that initial crisis in the Pusan perimeter. So all of these pressures are there for MacArthur. You know, to try and create this landing force somehow, even as he's really debating quite ferociously with the Joint Chiefs and anybody else who will debate him over the whole Inchon concept.
Talk about how MacArthur viewed the sort of macro picture as opposed to the sort of fundamental, sort of basic, how do I get the Marines to mount this thing, the sort of nuts and bolts. What levels above that was he thinking, whether it's diplomacy or what the South Koreans would think or what Mao would do or any of that stuff in his sort of calculation?
Yeah, so MacArthur's wearing a lot of hats at this point in 1950, because remember, he's a whole theater commander, so he's responsible for more than just Korea. Korea, arguably, before the invasion, is just this ancillary part of his theater. And his main focus, of course, is the occupation of Japan and the transformation of that country. At the diplomatic level, there's a lot of talk going on about how we're going to negotiate a permanent peace treaty with them and give Japan its independence again, and all that is kind of in the offing. So he's overseeing that, but MacArthur is really I often say, the ultimate Asia firster. I mean, he's been that in World War II. He was an ardent opponent of the Europe First policy in World War II. He felt it was wrong-headed. He felt in 1942 it was plain immoral, because his viewpoint was, why aren't power brokers in Washington sending me the help I need in the Philippines, my Americans and Filipinos, who are, after all, our country, versus the Soviet Union? So he was angry over that from the beginning, and he was arguing in 1942 and beyond that America's future would lay in Asia. And as we look back on it now, I think MacArthur had some level of insight there. It didn't mean that Europe wasn't still going to be crucially important. It's kind of a plus one. And so I think maybe this starts to vindicate his view a little bit, but he was even saying in 1950, he would often say, we are fighting Europe's fight here. He would love to have that kind of condescending view, but he was very dismissive of the Soviet threat in Europe, or maybe kind of writing off Europe as a lost cause, and Asia is where we ought to be. So he's kind of thinking along those lines. He doesn't understand a lot about enemy intentions, Chinese intentions, Soviet intentions. The intel is just not very good. But when the Korean War happens, he believes this is the place to square accounts with communism in Asia, and he thinks it's at least possible, in part by involving Chiang Kai-shek and his guys, the nationalist Chinese, that maybe this can take down Mao's regime somehow. But all of that is much easier said than done, and that's partially where he's going to run afoul in the months to come.
And vindicating, I guess, his belief that he was getting sort of the short end of the strategic stick. Another of the factoids that my students walk away scratching their heads about, the U.S. In its sort of overall expenditures in World War II, 85% of them went to Eurasia, and 15% went to the Pacific. So the U.S. is fighting by itself in the Pacific, with MacArthur at the point of the spear, and it is literally the sort of second thought after the main game in continental Europe, especially.
And he still resented it.
Of course, yeah.
But
he wasn't wrong.
But the interesting thing is that by 1944 and 5, by the end of there, at that point, there was a lot more priority. He's getting more stuff, and yet he's still complaining. He's second only to Eisenhower in terms of his combat power at that point. But he never could quite get past the idea that Washington didn't quite get it, and that he had a paranoid side to him, where he always felt there were people in Washington plotting against him. They were sabotaging his views, and obviously this will really come into play as you get deeper into 1951. But a lot of that can be traced to World War II. That resentment, like you said, that he didn't get the priority, and so he's still kind of smarting from that. And he hopes maybe to kind of wake up the American public, and thus Washington, to give priority to Asia and the Pacific, and he hopes Korea will do that.
So in your account of the battle, are there moments in it that you can pinpoint as being sort of hinges or pivots where it could have gone a different way? There's this beach, or there's this company, or there's some other thing where things could have turned out very differently than the success we saw?
I think it definitely could have turned out differently in this sense. Mao is a really first-rate military leader on some level, certainly as a guerrilla leader and building his movement during World War II, yes. But he obviously understands a lot about military strategy. And he's trying to tell the North Koreans, as you get deeper into the summer of 1950, and they're not able to snuff out the UN presence in the Pusan perimeter, the war is continuing, the Americans are successfully reinforcing the perimeter, the South Korean regime does not collapse. He's telling the North Koreans, Kim Il-sung and his guys, hey, I think there's a very good chance that the Americans are going to launch an amphibious invasion somewhere. And that's just how they operate. That's probably what they're going to do. And he mentions Inchon as one of the key places where there could be an invasion. And the North Koreans are like, well, thank you for your input. We do appreciate that. But remember how, they're pretty hard pressed at that point. Their supply lines are getting beaten up by the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Naval Aviation. They've suffered a heck of a lot of casualties. The war has turned into a more protracted thing than they anticipated. And so it's as if, you're the busy person with a lot of things on your plate and someone comes up to you from the side and says, oh, by the way, maybe you ought to worry about this. You're like, yeah, okay, I'll get to that next week. So the North Korean forces are quite weak when they might have been much stronger. Because obviously most of what they have is going to deal with the Pusan perimeter, and they're still hoping to snuff that out. The other element of this too that plays into this is mines in the water. I mean, these are narrow waters. Mines can wreak havoc on your ships and shipping and your maneuverability and all that kind of stuff. So the Soviets had sent some of their kind of first line new mines to go to the North Koreans, perhaps to go to Inchon and elsewhere along the coast, because there's other places where the UN could evade. But the North Koreans had either not had time or inclination to do much about that. Okay, so how does this play out? The interesting element in Inchon that I think is often overlooked is there's this naval officer named Eugene Clark, and there's a Korean naval officer named Young, who's like his second guy and really the most important guy on some level. But they go in to, I mentioned the islands that are in the Inchon harbor. They go in and they set up on one of those islands. They have this small group that goes in of Koreans and then Clark. And then they mobilize local guys because they find out on the island where they land, they find out, the people here are loyal to the Seoul government and they don't like the North Koreans. So they recruit the young men and they basically turn into this little mini military force that's gathering really good intel about the tides, about the shipping lanes, about the North Korean capability. It's incredibly risky, though, too, because they can be compromised, and thus Operation Chromite can be compromised. So this is like as of September 1st, I think, and the invasion's on the 15th. These guys are in play for 2 weeks. The North Koreans know they're there. And so what are the North, it's one of those imponderables, the North Koreans telling themselves, why would these guys be there? What's going on with that? But the subplot, too, is that the Air Force is bombing all these different possible landing sites, not just Inchon. So they're trying to confuse them over the whole thing. But Clark and his guys, I think, especially the Koreans who are with him, Lieutenant Young and the others, I think they're kind of the unsung heroes of the whole Inchon invasion, because they are the ones who get the information that the MacArthur's invasion forces need as much as anything. They're the ones who neutralized some of the mines that were there, and some of the North Korean defenders. They softened them up, and all at the price of maybe compromising the operation. But fortunately, that doesn't happen. But Clark worried about it to the end. The tragic part of this thing, though, too, is that Clark and some of the members of his team are evacuated, because that was part of the plan anyway, to go to this lighthouse in a small island to tip off, like as a kind of guiding point when the invasion force comes in on the 14th, I think it is. So when they do that, they leave behind dozens of these local guys on that island who had helped them, and the North Koreans then come to that island and they round up many of these guys and execute them. And I think, in a way, they are the sort of unsung heroes of the whole Operation Chromite, is these young men who just joined up out of immediate loyalty to Clark and his guys and the Seoul government to say, yes, we are going to help you any way we possibly can, and they're a major force multiplier. I think that's a human side of this story that is really lost. So let's say we are in the 1st Marine Division, or in the 5th Marine Regiment, one of the first to go in, or the 1st Marine Regiment. We don't know any of this. We have no idea. It's another invasion. We've been scraped together. We've been trained up for this, and then we're basically, if our ships can get in there, and we're not clobbered by coastal guns or whatever, we're going to land basically right there at Inchon. So it's this very, very small beach. Oh, by the way, there's hardly any beach too, and then leading up to a seawall and then the urban area. And so it's kind of surreal. And I'm sure many of you have seen pictures of it. Of some of these First Marines getting off their landing craft, going straight up to a seawall with ladders, so that when the landing craft come in, they've got ladders sticking out of them, and one of the observers said it looked like an insect antenna kind of thing, from a distance. So it's a really weird invasion from many standpoints, but there isn't all that much opposition, and one of the reasons is the key fortified island is called Wolmi-do. That just means Wolmi Island, okay? So That's like right next to Inchon, right there in the harbor. And so there's at least a battalion from the 5th Marines that are going to go in there, and they're going to neutralize a force of several hundred North Koreans. The guns had already been degraded by airstrikes, by Clark's people to some extent. And so within about, an hour, 2 hours, Walmy is more or less neutralized, and that probably would have been the biggest bone in the throat of the invasion, I would say, at least.
So I wonder if you could put the success of the invasion, which I think you write that MacArthur called it a 5,000 to 1.
He called it that, but MacArthur had this penchant for such hyperbole. No, I don't. I think it's silly. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's not, I mean, let's make it 3 to 1, okay? I mean, it's, it's not 5,000 to 1. I mean, that's like, come on now. So, but MacArthur loved that kind of hyperbole because he loved the idea of himself as this kind of mythical figure who could see things that other people didn't, because sometimes he could, but but in this case he wants to build it up a little more than he can. And you see the same thing with the Hollandia invasion, honestly, where it's for almost a generation of World War II, you'll have this kind of narrative that MacArthur and his people sort of sell us on. Oh my gosh, he just had this bold thing, and it was this reckless gamble, and it all paid off. Well, no, he had their entire order of battle. He knew where they were and where they weren't. He had captured their code book, so he had their playbook, okay? So it was a smart move, an innovative move, but not like this massive gamble. I think Inchon is similar, though it does have more risk to it, I think, on some level. I don't think it's a 5,000 to 1 gamble. I think it's a reasonable risk, which is the reason why the Joint Chiefs are going to do it. Because if it was a 5,000 to 1 gamble, do you really think Admiral Forrest Sherman, General J. Lawton Collins, General Hoyt Vandenberg, General Bradley, Harry Truman, do you really think they're going to sign off on a 5,000 to 1 gamble? No, but this is MacArthur we're talking about. It's one of the reasons why he's so fun to talk about, because he has this kind of hyperbolic side too. But yeah, it's certainly it's a great moment for him, arguably the greatest.
Well, and because he's fun to talk about, what was the impact of the success of Inchon on his relationship with Truman, and how does that figure into the eventual, spoiler alert, sort of break?
Yeah, it kind of goes sideways, doesn't it? So yeah, the Inchon invasion, Chromite, whatever you want to call it, is pretty clearly a success within 2 days. You can tell. The North Koreans have been taken off guard. You end up, the 1st Marine Division captures the town of Inchon and the port pretty much intact and pretty quickly. Now you end up in a pretty heavy urban fight though after that. That's what we tend to forget. Pretty much the whole 1st Marine Division is going to be fighting to liberate Seoul. The 7th Infantry Division is going to be doing this. The 187th Airborne Brigade Combat Team. I mean, all these guys are going to be in play to some extent. But the way this is played out as we get deeper towards the end of September, like around this time of September, is that the war has completely turned around because, of course, Walton Walker's 8th Army has broken out of the Pusan perimeter, and they will link up with the invasion force from Inchon. I should mention, too, and this is so MacArthur, in organizing this invasion force, he has basically created a new corps. So basically, like if you're an army commander, you have tens of thousands of troops under your command. That's the 8th Army under Walker. And then directly under them is a corps, C-O-R-P-S. And they're usually like Roman numerals. So there's I Corps, there's 9th Corps, and there's 10 Corps. 10 Corps is created for the Inchon invasion. So it includes South Korean units, of course, 1st Marine Division, 7th Infantry Division, and the 187th. Okay. It's under Ned Allman, who had been MacArthur's chief of staff. He keeps him as the chief of staff, but he also makes him the 10 Corps commander, and then he's not under 8th Army command. So he creates this sort of weirdly independent command that's going to be roaming around on its own, sort of, and this will create some real communication and command problems for the future. So when the invasion happens, though, MacArthur can now all of a sudden do no wrong. And so he's been completely vindicated in his view. He's argued for this, and it's been his baby from the start, and it has worked, and so he gets the political cachet from that. So when it comes to Washington policymakers, the Joint Chiefs on up, Yeah, just do whatever the man says at this point. He must know what he's talking about, and after all, he is MacArthur, you know. He is the greatest of all our commanders, and all the cult of personality you've had around MacArthur for years. He also has political dimensions to him that I'm sure you're all aware of. He's very popular on the Republican side of the aisle, especially with the Asia Firsters. The Asia Firsters tended to be Republicans, not always, but so they certainly are in the mood to support MacArthur no matter what he does. And Truman has never quite liked MacArthur, of course, but he must say this has worked, and so, you know, all right, he's earned the right to make the next call, in a way, if you think of it that way.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say if you were placing bets in the later 40s prior to the war, but certainly during it, on which former or current general would be a presidential candidate, MacArthur would rank above Eisenhower for the sort of the smart money.
Certainly in MacArthur's view. Yeah. Yeah, so
Just asking.
you just asking. So there's a long history of that, too, because MacArthur, of course, had, troublingly, in my opinion, really run for president in 1943 and 1944 when he was on active duty as a military officer, as a theater commander. He used his two key staffers, Dick Sutherland and Willoughby, to basically liaison with Senator Vandenberg, one of the key Republican senators, who was basically running a MacArthur for president campaign as we get into 1944. And so MacArthur was hoping he'd be drafted in the convention, and there'd be this big groundswell for him, and he would defeat FDR, whom he really didn't quite like. They were sort of frenemies, in a way, from back in the days when MacArthur was chief of staff in the 1930s. And so you already have this, and then in 1948, he was kind of hoping that, again, to be drafted as a Republican candidate, and it didn't quite happen. Obviously, Dewey wins the nomination, but then there's always 1952. That's going to be the next one, too. What is really galling for him, of course, is that his one-time aide, Dwight Eisenhower, will be, of course, much more politically potent and more viable for the Republicans of all people, too. That adds salt in the wound. And so, unfortunately for MacArthur, going forward, this is well after Inchon, obviously. This is 1952. He'll kind of humiliate himself in the sense of having a kind of partial campaign that year and wanting to be entered in a nomination, and obviously it goes nowhere, and Ike gets the nomination, and it had to be really difficult for him. But it's also kind of a product of his hubris going back many years, that he'd always had this kind of political dimension to him, and he was a little bit out of his depth when it came to that. When it came to strategy, when it came to valor, MacArthur was in his element. When it came to common decency in terms of how he would treat people and basically rehabilitating Japan, these were his strengths. But the whole political arena, MacArthur did not quite get that. And he was just not really a political animal for its own sake. He was in terms of military and security issues.
So in the short and medium and long term after Inchon, for MacArthur, but also for the military generally, institutionally, what are the lessons that people took from it, from within inside the national security complex? Is this like, we know how to do it now, here's our template, and we're going to keep this forever? Or
there's a sense that, what's interesting on that side, in terms of like amphibious ops, there had been a kind of thinking in the 1940s, late 40s, that amphibious operations would never happen again. It's one of the reasons why our capabilities have atrophied. General Bradley from our own state was quite a skeptic of the continuation of amphibious operations because of how the world had changed in terms of communications and air power and nuclear power and these things. Inchon shows that there's still a place for amphibious invasions for those who know what they're doing and against an operator that is overmatched in terms of air and sea capability. Of course, going forward, we don't see this happen much. It's really good to be amphibious capable, of course, but is that really what's going to be the determinant for many wars? Well, maybe not so much. So they're gleaning those lessons at the time and thinking, well, maybe amphibious operations are going to be relevant. But really more to the point in terms of what's happening in Korea, they're thinking by the end of September and early October, well, North Korea's done. And so now, instead of containment of communism, which means restoring the status quo at the 38th parallel, the two Koreas, what you had before the war, let's go to rollback, and let's go and eliminate the North Korean regime. And that's where, of course, this whole thing just completely goes sideways. So Inchon is interesting, from the long sweep of military history. I don't know how often you see an operation that succeeds so mightily at the tactical and strategic level initially that ends up as such just getting destroyed in terms of its relevance strategically within a 2-month period. Because by the end of November, the entire war has changed. The Chinese have gotten in more or less full force. And then, obviously MacArthur's, his stock is not high once that happens because he had largely dismissed the possibility of the Chinese getting into the war. And when they do, that's the absolute game changer of the whole Korean War.
Yeah, the sort of serves in the tennis match are June invasion, September Inchon, November Chinese intervention, and then it freezes once they get back to the midpoint of the peninsula.
Yeah, you have this tennis match, the ping ponging, whatever, that goes back and forth with these maneuver operations. We've got when the Chinese actually get in October, and that puts a dent in that advance to the Yalu at that point in North Korea. But they're defeated, and the advance resumes. It's really the November element of that offensive that leads to the complete turnaround. So then the UN forces are kicked out of North Korea in 2 waves, in a way, too, by the way, because remember, 10th Corps is under Ned Alman and not under Walton Walker's control of 8th Army. So there's the rest of the 8th Army over there out of the line of communication with 10th Corps, which has been put back aboard ships and landed at Wonsan into North Korea. And then you have the famous Chosin Reservoir battle, which I'll point out obnoxiously is not, by the way, an exclusively Marine battle. We associate it with the Marines, but there's 2 Army divisions, the 3rd and the 7th, that are there fighting alongside, and by the way, South Koreans, who are always part of this and really get the worst of it. So there's your other reversal. And then you have, of course, Walker gets killed in the Jeep accident 2 days before Christmas, and Ridgway takes over 8th Army. 8th Army is unified with 10 Corps, a part of it under Ridgway, and then he will basically have the other seesaw now, pushing them back as of like late January, February, into March. Seoul liberated again. The Chinese and North Koreans try another offensive. They go on into May is by the time this plays out. So it's been about 11 months of maneuver warfare. And it's really, really kind of dizzying that it goes back and forth. And then the 2 sides figure out neither of us is really going to be able to win a total victory here. We got to do something else.
So I appear to have been downgraded to a corded microphone, but that's on purpose because
it's a message.
We would like for to have a little time for Q&A, and we have a mobile microphone in the hands of Cassie or Morgan over there. So if you've got some thoughts, now's your chance.
Hi. Kind of expanding a bit strategically in terms of the whole Asia First ideology. So 4 years from that point, the French would lose control of Indochina.
Mm-hmm.
Did MacArthur in the last years of his life start to kind of agitate about that, and as well as his fellow hawks in the Republican Party?
Yeah, so MacArthur, of course, famously gets fired in April 1951, and he's gone into retirement. He's hoped to be president. This hasn't happened. In the meantime, of course, the war in Vietnam had been going on all this time that it was going on in Korea. And it's why the French are not heavily involved in Korea. They have 1 battalion, by the way. These guys fight extremely well. They're led by a guy who was a 3-star general, had been wounded 17 times, decorated many times, changes his name, has gets a lesser rank to lieutenant colonel so he can lead this battalion in combat in Korea. So, I mean, it's just absolutely amazing, this guy, but it shows you how overstretched the French truly were. MacArthur will be a bit ambivalent about American involvement in Southeast Asia. He's not necessarily banging the drums to get in during Dien Bien Phu or whatever, as some others were at that point in time. If we fast forward to about 10 years, though, he kind of sees the Vietnam War as more conventional than otherwise, and he advises Westmoreland, who eventually goes and becomes the MACV commander. So the advice he gets from MacArthur is not quite to the point. on some level. So no, MacArthur is not by then one of the complete hawks saying we need to get involved in Vietnam whole cloth. He had after he'd been fired, obviously he famously testifies before the Senate. He does seem to advertise this bigger concept of war. And I think that the sobering moment is to realize, well, we're stretched our resources about as far as they can go without a total mobilization. So how do we reconcile that? And that's why, MacArthur's vision is not necessarily going to prevail, even on the Republican side going forward, at that point at least.
I have a question. I've always been interested in the human aspect. That is, how often overconfidence or arrogance actually really sinks generals. The North Koreans clearly were overconfident. They thought that anyone would be crazy to invade Inchon because of the things you mentioned, the tides and all of that. But do you think after MacArthur's victory at Inchon that he was so overconfident as he raced to the Yellow River that he ignored the signs that the Chinese were already infiltrating behind his lines?
Oh, I think absolutely. There is definitely a hubris there. MacArthur had always had this characteristic of, well, it can't be because I don't want it to be. And what I mean by that, you see this happen in World War II a lot with so-called mopping up operations. He would release these communiques that basically said, oh, the battle's over, and actually it was just beginning, especially if you and I are fighting it, So he'd always had this tendency, and now it's kind of reinforced by what's happened at Inchon and by the fact that we don't have good intel about Chinese intentions. And this isn't fully MacArthur's fault, but what is his fault is he doesn't plan for the worst case scenario. You may not know your enemy's capabilities, but you might have to assume the worst too, especially if your armies are that vulnerable. So I definitely think there's a kind of arrogance there. There's a kind of assumption that he always has this assumption that he understands Asians the way no one else does or something. And he's constantly throwing that in the faces of other Americans. And that I think that kind of comes into play a little bit. He's like, oh, I understand the mindset. They'll never get in. And then, yes, you're right, he's dismissing these reports. It's infuriating for Oliver Smith, who's the 1st Marine Division commander, and also the Shorty Sewell, the 3rd Division commander, that they're getting these reports up to Tokyo and being told by people in Tokyo, no, you're not facing Chinese. It's like, come on now. So I definitely think that's a factor, yeah.
I have a question for you. First, my dad was in the 1st Marine Division, 1st Brigade, 5th Marines, 1st Assault Wing of Inchon. So
wow.
Thank you very much for everything that you're doing here. My question piggybacks off of his. Because we had the Chinese Exclusion Act back in the 1850s, how much of this bad intel do you credit to prejudice, bias? Because we're looking down, like you said there, but then since we should learn from history, what's your opinion on when they dismissed the foreign military and culture studies with the red team? That was out of Fort Leavenworth with Command College. Because to me, that would be the natural progression of what we should learn from Korea.
Of course.
As we go into other countries that we have something like that, and now we no longer do.
Right. Yeah, I mean, preaching to the choir here, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely absurd, in my opinion, to cut that and to not have foreign military studies and to not know the potential culture of your adversaries, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, kudos to your father, by the way, and to all veterans of the Korean War and others too. The rest of the question, if you could repeat it, please.
How much do you credit this to?
Yeah, racism. For sure.
We don't have a Korean society here. We don't know anything about Korean barbecue. There's no way we can relate to
Right.
this. And then you add on to it, this is the UN. We're under the UN umbrella, and all these many different languages going on.
Oh, yeah.
It seems to me like a recipe for disaster from the beginning.
It is, and I definitely think there's a racism there, You'd already seen this in, like you said, the Chinese Exclusion Act. You'd seen it in World War II to some extent in dealing with the Chiang Kai-shek's regime. This had already happened, but I'm talking about like the on-site commanders. Ned Allman is a prime example of what I'm referring to. You'll recall he was MacArthur's chief of staff, who he puts in charge of 10th Corps. Allman had commanded the 92nd Infantry Division in World War II, which is an African-American division, the Buffalo Soldiers. And he's really a straight-up racist on many levels. He's a solid tactical commander. He's very courageous, but he's quite racist. And so when he's getting these reports of Chinese attacks, he eventually, in exasperation, says to some of his troops, "Oh, you're not afraid of a bunch of Chinese laundrymen, are you?" So, I mean, right there, when you have someone like that with that worldview, it's like, okay, you're operating from the sort of prison of your own racism. And I think it's very ironic, too, because the major reason we get into war with Japan is over China, over our alliance and involvement with China. The China lobby, the Asia Firsters, the pro-China Americans, and there's a long association of Americans in China. And so here we are just a few years later kind of dismissing them, at least some of the key players, not all. I think that is definitely playing a hand in here. But also, too, there's that. But there's such a dearth of intelligence, human intelligence, and understanding the intentions of Mao and his regime. For gosh sakes, General Ridgway, who's as fine a commander as you will ever have in the United States Armed Forces in the history of this country, he doesn't even know who the opposite commander is that he's facing in Korea until years later. Okay, and so we don't even know who their commander is. That's the thing that is just so mind-blowing to me. That the other side is just kind of opaque in the minds of all too many Americans.
And if I could chime in, there is also, in addition to whatever sort of cultural blind spots involving race and Asia generally, the conception at the time is that communism is itself a monolith. And so that whatever's happening in China, Korea, or Russia is all directed from Moscow. And so the notion is whatever racial gradations there may be or blind spots there may be, it's almost secondary to the fact that we have an ideological enemy that is directing things like the Korean invasion. And Kim did go to Mao and did go to Stalin and ask essentially for permission to invade the South to kick off the whole war in the first place. So without discounting any of the sort of racial blinders that might be in the picture, there are bigger, I would argue, ideological blinders that are in place because they don't take into account whatever cultural differences there are within the countries that are embracing communism because of the notion that communism is itself this monolith. And that tends to sort of drive, especially at this early stage in the Cold War, a lot of the way Americans view the threat. I want to sort of seize in moderator prerogative and say, I think got one here, so we're running up on time, but we've got another question to close us out, so sir.
The question I have to ask is, in some of the historical writings, you read Korean War or the Korean conflict. And my question to you is, why is that? Because it really was a war.
I'm sorry, what was the last part you said?
The question is, why is that?
Yeah. So, because, Truman, of course, notoriously calls it a police action initially because he doesn't want to send a message of, well, we're mobilizing, we're really going to war and all that. This is a political thing. But part of it, too, is that now we're in the nuclear era, and so an actual declaration of war could lead to a total war, which could be nuclear war. And you're up against, eventually, when China gets into the equation here, a peer operator. And so there's a little bit of a reluctance to call it a war. It's a conflict. But you know what? If you and I are on the ground somewhere, fighting in the snow, fighting for our lives, it's a war, isn't it? And so we know it is. We just don't call it that. And so it's part. I think the larger takeaway is this is a pattern ever since World War II. Congress has never actually declared war since World War II. But we've fought in wars, haven't we? So basically, Congress gives war powers to the executive branch usually until they don't, and that's the way this will work. So part of that plays out in the rhetoric too. This plays out a little bit too in the naming of operations. So when Ridgway in one of his counteroffensives wants to name it Operation Killer, he gets a little bit of pushback from Washington D.C. saying, oh, I don't know, that might send the wrong message. He's like, well,
So violent for a military
it's
man.
so violent, like, well, you know what? In war, there's killing, and we see this a decade later, by the way, in Vietnam. One of the first operations is called Masher White Wing. They're like, oh, that's a little too, saber rattling. Can we come up with something more benign? Or, and it's just like, oh my gosh, how silly is this? But it comes down to the real nuts and bolts of, politics, diplomacy, and trying to avoid, fortunately to this day, an all-out World War III style conflict.
Great. Well, thank you, John. And let me
Thanks.
take pride in this. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Join me. You beat me to the punch. I was going to invite the applause. Good work, man. Thank you all, and have a good night.
Yeah.